Hello again. I hope you all enjoyed that fascinating and revealing first episode of The Fourth Estate. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Joining director Liz Garbus, our New York Times Washington bureau chief Elisabeth Bumiller, White House correspondent Maggie Haberman, and Washington correspondent Michael Schmidt. Maggie and Mike each received the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting last month. As part of our New York Times staff coverage of the Trump team's connections with Russia and its attempts to sway FBI Director James Comey. Mike was also the recipient of a second Pulitzer Prize, the prestigious Public Service Medal, as part of the New York Times staff coverage of sexual abuse by Harvey Weinstein, Bill O'Reilly, and other powerful men. Moderating the conversation tonight is Sam Dolnick, an assistant managing editor of the New York Times, who leads the Newsroom's exploration of new opportunities to distribute Times journalism across platforms. This includes podcasts, virtual reality, and other digital efforts, and television initiatives, including The Fourth Estate. So please join me now in welcoming Sam Dolnick, Liz Garbus, Elisabeth Bumiller, Maggie Haberman, and Mike Schmidt.
You're like, oh, look, the chairs. Water.
Hi, everybody. Hi. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you enjoyed the film. We're going to talk with these folks and then open it up. But I wanted to just start, congratulations on the Pulitzer Prizes. Congratulations on the movie. And I wanted to start by talking about feelings and what it feels like these days in the Washington Bureau. We're 17 months into this story. Are you exhausted? Is there still exhilaration? What is it like to be in the trenches chasing the story day after day, month after month? Elisabeth?
We don't know when it's going to end. I think there's exhaustion. There's still some exhilaration, but there's a lot of just uncertainty about when this will actually end, and there's no end in sight. And it's every day is on a pretty big boil. You know, I've said this before. In the old days, in the Washington Bureau under Obama, there'd be maybe a week of a giant story, you know, opening to Cuba or something, and then it would settle down, and some other desk like International or Metro or BizDay would have the big story, and we'd be sort of, you know, it wouldn't be on us. But every single day in the Washington Bureau now, it's on us. I mean, every day there's like 2 or 3 major stories that we're dealing with. I've got, you know, endless calls from New York, tons of competition from the Washington Post and everybody else, and there's never a moment actually to sit down to reflect. I mean, you guys
as reporters, how do you guys feel?
No, that sounds about right. There have been a couple of moments in the last few weeks when there has not been some massive story. We've had actually a couple of lulls. And you end up having that feeling like you left your car keys somewhere and you're searching for something, and then it's, oh, there's not something we're chasing. But it is still exhilarating. It is true, though, that it's not just the not knowing that there's no end in sight. This is a choose your own adventure that isn't actually our choice, right? I mean, this could go in a bunch of different directions. We don't know what's going to happen with the Mueller investigation. There's a lot that we can't see. Trump likes making everybody guess, so every day starts out with a lot of uncertainty. Look at what happened with the North Korea summit today, right? That's a great example, and it was just a 180 from what we heard last night was likely to happen. So I think a lot of it is just getting used to the sensation of disorientation. I think that's a big piece of reporting in DC right now.
I just think the remarkable thing about the story is that every week it seems to outdo itself.
Right.
And how is that possible unless someone is actually writing the story? It's like, how is it that something more unusual or outlandish or challenging happens every week? And it just keeps on going. And that's the thing that constantly surprises me about it. it's like, what will happen next? And the creativity of this administration to do the things that they do is just remarkable, I think.
Can we talk about that? What is your strategy for covering? I mean, you've all covered many administrations.
Our strategy.
No, when you don't know if is this just a tweet or is this official policy? And this complicated relationship with the truth that the administration has.
Well,
how do you cover that?
Because the tweets are policy. I mean, we treat them early on in the administration. A group of Times readers came to the bureau. It's right after Trump was inaugurated, and they were very upset about the tweets. And I said, well, but he's the they said, why can't you just ignore them? And I said, he's the president of the United States. They're actually, some of them are really important policy. Some of them are, nuts. But so, so we cover them seriously. We actually, what we've done in the bureau now, Liz knows this, we have somebody in at 6 a.m. She's on sort of tweet duty. We have editors in at 6 a.m. And we have 6 White House correspondents, Maggie's one of them, we used to have 4, we now have 6. And so we treat the tweets like press releases from an earlier White House. Some of them, obviously, you can't ignore. They're just, Trump says something great about something he just went to. But this morning, we dealt with it as a fact check because they were so over the top. But the last couple of mornings, he's been going after Mueller, so that's a real story to cover, which is the President of the United States is going after the investigator who's investigating him. That's a story.
They're a real-time, his tweets are a real-time look into what he's thinking. Not every time, as Elisabeth says. But Peter Baker, our colleague, always likes to say that it's like having the Nixon tapes played out loud. And it really is true. It's sort of astonishing, the stuff that Trump just says and does. There was early on, I think, a belief about the tweets in the same way that there was a belief about Trump in general, that there's some strategy at play, that there's always some grander thing that he's reaching for. And that's often not the case. And sometimes there's a strategy, but often there isn't. And so if you start choosing what you're going to ignore broadly, to Elisabeth's point, you can't, because this is what's on the mind of the leader of the free world.
On the tweets, the thing that always seems to happen to me is that we spend all this time trying to figure out what the president's doing behind the scenes. Talk to all of these White House officials or lawyers or folks to find out something that he's done. And you go out and you find it and you bring it back and you're about to go to your editor and then you're kind of checking some things and you realize that he tweeted the same thing. So these things that you thought were so newsworthy that he had done behind the scenes that were comments about the investigation or trying to influence the investigation or dealing with Sessions, the Attorney General. He just says it publicly.
And beyond Twitter, you've got one faction of the White House saying one thing's going to happen, another faction saying another. What's the strategy for finding out what's real? How do you do that?
Answer that.
Sure. To the best, we do the best we can. It actually began in the campaign. We realized pretty early on, Trump always has 2 competing factions at least, and sometimes more than that. He likes having, this isn't a team of rivals. It's like the team of the Bloods and the Crips, and they're leaking on each other all the time. And it's a little less like that now than it was last year, but there's still a fair amount of it. We tend to write our stories with an appropriate amount of caveating. There's lots of, the traditional to be sure graph. To be sure, this could mean nothing, used to exist, once in a story. And now we find ourselves having to asterisk a lot of it because, on the one hand, one person says this, on the other, this person says this. All we can do is just present, I think, the fullest picture of what we know to the reader. And I think we've done a pretty good job of it.
Liz, let's talk about the film. Tell us the origin story. When did you decide that this was the movie you wanted to make?
Yeah, well, I wanted to also say that this is the first of 4 episodes.
Right.
So you're seeing kind of a quarter of the film, and the rest of it will come online this weekend. We follow these guys and their colleagues over the course of the year, and then even into the Pulitzers last month. So it started the day that the president-elect was tweeting about a meeting here with these folks, a meeting that he was having. He was going around to the various news organizations, and I don't really know why he was doing.
No, he wasn't. He just came to.
He just came to the.
Oh, but I
Times.
thought he went to CNN and had a meeting. Oh, he didn't have a
First
meeting
place
with
he
Jeff?
came.
Oh, okay.
I think that
the
there was
first interview
there was a
with the
meeting that
Times.
he did with network heads at Trump Tower, but we were the only newsroom that he met with in full, and we were the only ones he came to.
All right, well, look at that. I've been telling this story wrong.
Not that I have those details memorized or anything, but that was.
But in any case, so he was talking about this meeting on Twitter, which was said, and then he canceled it on Twitter, saying that the Times had changed the rules.
Which
and
we didn't.
The Times had responded, no, this meeting was never going to be off the record. The invitation for the meeting still stands, and it's, this will be on the record. And then he, gave up and sort of tweeted, okay, I'm going to the meeting. And it was just, there was nothing extraordinary about that. And now we've come to, expect these reversals within, 20 minutes on Twitter. But it just was a window into what would be going on between Trump and the press all year long. And I just felt like you didn't know which way this would go. You didn't know how extreme. I remember when they kicked Glenn Thrush out of the gaggle, out of the briefing that day. Was it like, okay, so are they just going to be over? Or they're going, there was always this kind of sense of like what will happen next, and there still is, right? So I'm the daughter of a First Amendment lawyer. I think this was where I wanted to spend my time if I could during this year of sort of extraordinary political change. And then I went and talked to you. and now here we are.
And when Dean Baquet, the executive editor, signed off and the authorities at the Times decided that they wanted to participate in your project, one of the rules was, you have to find your own way. We're not going to say that it's a part of anyone's job to talk with you for this project. Can you talk about how you went around the Bureau and got to know these people and convince them to participate? Mike Schmidt there at the end, you'll notice he was not in episode 1. He was not going to talk to Liz Garbus. He's the star of episode 2. She won him over. But can you talk about how you did that? And then I want to hear from your side as well.
Oh, I just went and I talked to everybody and asked, and and then folks like Mike who were not predisposed, or another journalist who said, when you're here, I'm going to go to Pan Quotidien and work there. There are various levels of warmth, and then there are others who were very eager and were worried about how their colleagues who weren't being filmed would feel. So there was quite a range of responses, but we also just were sort of relentless. with Mike, it was no for a very long time, but we continued to kind of show up, and when there was an opening, we knocked on the door again. So really that's the way it is with all documentaries. It's just like these guys were under kind of more pressure than most people are in the workplace. Not always the case. Other people have great pressures too, but this was a very, very intense year, and these guys were working really hard, and they're under the microscope.
And from your perspective, reporters, we are not used to being the story. How did you ever get comfortable with it? How did this year go for you?
No. Could someone mix it up?
I'm having PTSD looking right over this direction right now.
I think we got. It was hard, especially in the beginning. I found it exhausting actually to have the cameras there all day, because I felt like I had to behave. I know it probably doesn't look like I do always in the film, but I think that Liz doesn't like us to say this, but we were noisier and louder when they weren't there. We were under better behavior. But then as things, which is I know what you wanted to happen, as the year progressed, and we just got more used to the cameras, and we got really, really busy sometimes. Yeah. I just forgot about it because I just had stuff to do. And I figured, well, they're not going to use this. It's 600 hours. This will be cut out. But it was in the beginning. It was exhausting to have cameras there, in your face, and it's still hard to look at it.
You'll see as the series goes on, we do forget they're there. There'll be a couple of real key moments where you'll see that if somebody was paying attention, they would not have done things with the cameras around. So, yeah.
We were heading into, we knew from the beginning this was going to be this incredibly difficult story. And all of a sudden, we're heading into it, and these cameras show up in your face. Yeah. And I think for me, my first reaction was, we spend all this time trying to develop trust with people to get, as reporters, to get sources to tell you things. And here these people are just showing up. And I was like, You haven't earned this. You know, it's like, why are you here? And it was also kind of nerve-wracking. It's like, are they journalists like us? Are they going to be investigating us all year? What are they going to find? But what I realized was that they really wanted to tell our story. And they were really committed to that and committed to doing it in a fair way. And several months in, I sort of realized that, and I said, well, this is okay. And I relented.
Yeah, I mean, the intentions were clearly very good. And I think that did become clear to everybody. And especially at a moment when you have a president who's trying to turn us into the opposition party. I think it was, as the year went on, it became clearer, I think, to a lot of us, the importance. We would not normally sort of want to do this, right? I mean, and it was still uncomfortable. And there is that idea that we shouldn't be the story. But given that a lot of people I discovered in the course of the 2016 campaign and the early parts of the administration don't actually understand what newspapers do. They don't understand what journalists do. To the extent that it can be clear that this is not some sinister thing being cooked up in a lab, and it's not we are not what Trump paints us as, I thought that was useful.
But there was also a competitive issue because we're in this huge fight with the Washington Post. Right. And as we used to sit around and say, oh, the last scene of the documentary would be great. It'll be the Washington Post winning the Pulitzer Prize for the story. And here's a year and how the New York Times lost on a big story.
Yeah.
That was what Mazzetti was really worried about, was that, what if there's a giant screw up? It'll be on, it'll be there forever for all to see. There was a lot of risks doing this, and we were much more nervous about it in Washington than anybody was in New York. I can tell you that, and we didn't know in the beginning that there'd be so much in Washington. So
that's where the story is.
Yeah, I mean, and we knew that. I mean, we appreciated that, and of course understood that, and and we were still trying to do our job and make the film. And I would say, I'd say it was the hardest shooting was when there wasn't a lot happening. I mean, when there was, you guys just sort of spring into action and you get focused, and like standing behind Elisabeth at her desk when there's a breaking story is like air traffic control with, different countries coming in to, share knowledge and produce a story. I mean, it's quite wonderful to watch that. And I think in those moments, you were able to forget. It was what were really onerous, I think, when there wasn't a lot going on and we were very obtrusive. I guess we were always obtrusive, but
you were never non-present.
Yeah, no, you were obtrusive.
You were plenty there.
There was one night I actually went home early because I couldn't take it anymore. I felt you had one really aggressive cameraman.
Yes.
And I just finally had to go home and hide.
Yeah. And we were aware of that cameraman. He didn't return.
Right.
Liz, a year in the newsroom, what did you learn about journalism that surprised you? You are a lifelong reader. You come from a First Amendment family.
I think I was. I mean, it's kind of like what Maggie was just saying. I think that the kind of this. I think that the seriousness. I mean, it's not that I never thought journalists were serious. I guess I did expect there to be a little bit more of like a liberal bias spilling out all over the place. I think that as a New Yorker, it was sort of, I think maybe that was my fantasy about what the New York Times was, and I think that readers of the Times do bring that to the Times, as they want the Times, especially those on the left, wanted to reflect their ideology very badly, and they wanted to confirm their ideas in the opinion pages and also in their reporting. Mm-hmm. And when the Times doesn't do that, you see a lot of anger. I mean, often from the left and also from the right. And I think I understood that, these guys kind of are equal opportunity, truth finder. The ideology is really getting the story and is the truth and is getting it first and getting it right and not having to look back and regret it. And that was very clear. And without a lot of, concern about, partisanship. And that's what I felt. Mm.
Maggie, the president has a particular fascination with you. And
thanks, Sam.
It's complicated, right? I want to get this quote right. He recently tweeted that he doesn't speak to you and has nothing to do with you. Mike Schmidt responded by tweeting a photo of Maggie and the president in the White House.
Wearing this dress, so it's together. Real news.
And in the course of the Fourth Estate, I can't remember if it's this episode, of course, we see an interview. We see the president call you on your cell phone. Can you help us understand your relationship to him?
So, yeah, without getting into frequency of discussions and so forth, because I wouldn't talk about that, but the president doesn't really have relationships with anybody, honestly, this president. Presidents do, this one doesn't. Everything is some transaction with him. I have this very vivid memory of having a lunch with him it was either April or May of 2015, that I had shown up late for because they were trying to get me to write a story that he was going to declare his candidacy, and I didn't believe it because I had covered previous iterations of the non-candidacy. And his campaign manager at the time, Corey Lewandowski, was to my right, and Trump was to my left. We were, of course, at the Trump Grill in the basement of Trump Tower, and he was drinking a Diet Coke, and he was talking on and on about how much money they were going to spend, and I could tell he was getting very frustrated that I wasn't buying it. I didn't write a story. He did, obviously, run for president, and that perhaps was not my best call, but it was very defendable in retrospect. He's known me a while. I worked at the tabloids in New York, which, the New York Post is his first or second read still. And his understanding of the media kind of comes from the tabloid press, right? So there's some level of connection there. But he's also fascinated with the Times. I mean, I think that what's interesting about the subject that Liz picked and us is that there really is to your point about it going around that meeting, right? That became the genesis of why you wanted to do this project. Having the Times' approval is among the most important thing for this president, who nonetheless does nothing but sort of punch us in the face. But it all dates back 30 years to him being a developer from the outer boroughs, and the Times, in his mind, represented the elites who didn't approve of him and whose approval he wanted. And whose approval he still wants. I mean, he thought he was going to go to, everyone said he wouldn't win, and he won, and in his mind, he had acquired, the most impressive piece of real estate in the country, and he thought he would be treated with respect, and he showed up, and he was still hit pretty hard. And so the symbol of those hitting him still remains us. But it's always for him about seeing if he can get a better story. I don't know, to some extent, I don't know why it is that I trigger something, but anyway, that's as best as I can explain.
Really interesting what you just said.
And beyond Maggie, the administration has this hostile relationship with the press. We are the enemy of the people. Mike, Elizabeth, but Maggie, you too. How has his oppositional stance, shaped or influenced the work and the coverage that we do?
Well, we often say that we're not the opposition, we're not the resistance. Some of our readers see us that way, and we, as Liz pointed out, we disappoint them. We try to, when he goes after us, usually corporate, if it's really bad, it's a complete factual error. Usually corporate communications will tweet back or issue a statement. We don't respond, we just don't. Sometimes, I'm trying to think, we'll sometimes write a story saying Trump or the administration, we did it last week. What was it? Does anybody remember?
On what?
The long, boring story.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was it.
He didn't question the factual.
It was too long.
It was kind of long, right?
It wasn't boring. It's not boring.
No, but there was something. I don't remember now. God, this is an example of what happens.
Exactly.
There was a story last week that the administration just went after us for, and said this never happened. We will write a 500-word story saying, administration says this, not true or something. But mostly we just ignore it.
Right.
We don't respond.
It's hard to be. The pressure isn't just from him, right? I mean, to what both Elizabeth and Liz said, a lot of his critics want us to play a more oppositional role to him, and that really is not our job. I mean, I think a lot of people who are frustrated with, there's one entity whose mandate is to provide a check on the executive branch, and that's Congress. And people are, I think, transferring some of their frustrations with Congress onto us, the media generally, and the Times certainly specifically. And we can't get caught up in that either. This is where Twitter is actually a terrible thing, because he tweets and we all tweet. None of us have editors on Twitter, and the tone on Twitter can be very hard to modulate. And what can look like we're just correcting him can come off differently to someone else. So we're still, I think, figuring out in some ways how to deal with it, because it's still very strange.
Yeah, and actually in a later episode, we have a conversation with you with Dean Baquet about the use of the word lie, and there are people who are screaming, call him a liar, call it out, and Dean expresses a philosophy which is just being careful to not overuse that word, and it just reflects the kind of the ever-evolving nature of the rules in covering this story.
So I've got one more question. I want to open it up to the room, and we've also got people watching on Facebook Live who are able to submit questions. But I'd love to get your take. There's so many tentacles to the scandals in Washington now. There's all of the Russia stuff, and then our reporting shows it's not just Russia. There's Saudi Arabia and other countries who are meeting with Trump. There's the Comey firing and all of the circumstances around that. There's Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels. Which of these strands are you most interested in, and which ones should we be paying attention to?
Over to you.
If you look at all the issues in regards to the president, if you imagine all these things, whether it's collusion, obstruction, social media stuff, money issues, in regards to the president, the most conduct related to him is in the obstruction bucket. There's just a lot more stuff that involves him and his actions that we know about that have been investigated and he has to answer questions for. When we got a sense of the questions that Mueller wanted to ask Trump about, more than 2/3 of them are about obstruction. So if he has exposure, at least that we know about, that's where the greatest issue is. On collusion, there's just not a lot of things that involve him. Did he know about the Don Jr. meeting with Russians offering dirt in the summer of 2016 is a big Trump collusion question that we've never, the president says he didn't know about the meeting. So when you look at these issues on obstruction, that is the thing that, because there are so many different tentacles of this story, I was like, well, you can try and focus on all of them. You only get an inch deep. And I focus as much as I can on the obstruction one. And that's where there's a ton of questions.
Yeah. The Michael Cohen issue, though, I do think is one that is worth watching, as we like to say. Because I think that investigation, and it's still weird talking about this because I've known Michael Cohen for a really long time because I covered New York politics, and he ran for city council a gazillion years ago, and all sorts of iterations since. But that really seems to be the issue that has exposed, I think, him in terms of his personal business, obviously, in terms of the raid that was executed on his hotel room and house and office, and then potentially could expose the president depending on what's there. We don't know what's there, right? There's a lot of question marks about it, but there's these two parallel investigations going on, and the one that the president's lawyers, and Michael and I wrote about this when it began, that they were much more concerned about, and I think still are, was the Michael Cohen one. Because
they say, we understand the contours of Mueller, and they can give you these explanations why they're fine with Mueller, that there's no issues and such. Right. New York, they say, we have no idea what's going on, if they're speaking candidly. We have no idea what's going on, and we don't think we're getting a fair shake from the president or Michael Cohen about what may be in these documents. Right. So we're going to fight a second front war with the Justice Department, and it could potentially be more problematic than Mueller.
Good. Okay. Now, really, the last question. We started talking about the mood inside the Washington bureau. I'm curious of the mood inside the White House these days, with the midterms.
Read it every day. That's the least mysterious thing in the world. The president, I think, finally understands that the climate is real bad in the midterms for the Republicans, and that he can make it much worse depending on what he does. He has not been a particular help in the minds of Republican Party leadership toward keeping the number of seats that they need and talking about things like the tax bill, things that they feel they have accomplished. But he has gotten a little bit better about it in the last few weeks. He was on, this is what passes for a victory right now for the White House political staff, is the president didn't go off on tangents during a a rally in Indiana. Like that's what passes as a victory.
No, they thought it was a good story when Giuliani said that the president can't get indicted.
Yes, they
That's
were
a
happy.
great
They were happy with
really
that.
happy.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, that's great. That was good. Good moment.
I'm serious.
No, I know.
Low bar.
And one of the problems, although Mike makes a good point, one of the problems that the White House has right now is Rudy Giuliani is just out there basically as like a free agent TV star, and they have no idea what he's going to say. They have no idea who he's talking to. I saw Giuliani at CNN I guess it was last week, a few days ago, and he said, I spoke to the press office yesterday for the first time. I explained to them I can't talk to them because then I'm not an independent lawyer. And I thought, this is stressful for the White House. But they're kind of caught because there are some political professionals there who work there, people who actually understand party dynamics and think there is some case to sell for the Republicans, but they don't want to start setting any expectations because the second they do, he'll tweet or he'll say something or he'll give an interview that he hasn't told them about, and they're kind of trapped in the car with him driving. That's the mood.
That's the mood. That's a good mood. So we're going to open it up. We're going to bring out Jenny Carchman as well. She's the producer and Liz's co-director of The Fourth Estate. We've got microphones here and ask you to line up and to please keep these to questions for the question session. Thank you so much. And maybe as you're assembling, we can start with a Facebook question. Are you ready? Okay. Let's go over here.
Hi. I just wondered, Liz, were there any embargoed terms where you could shoot, but then you might have to get permission later as to whether or not you could actually use the content of what you filmed? And did the Times have any say at all in terms of seeing it before it ran? And just, was there any concern that any of it would be sort of privileged information and proprietary along the way?
Yeah, the kind of the rules of engagement were that the Times would review the film, all the episodes before air, and making sure that we were not revealing any sources inadvertently. And so that was, but there was never a sort of an embargo on scenes, anything specific. It was kind of a blanket review of what we were going to put out before we put it out to, not for creative control, but for source protection.
And Elisabeth, were you comfortable with that, with those terms in terms of?
Yeah, we were allowed to look at, we saw it before it aired. And I don't think, well, there were some things that were taken. I mean, like some, no, I don't think there was any revealing of sources, was there?
No.
No, there were scenes that were shot that we were nervous about that they weren't used. There was one scene that was just sort of a medley of sources. I remember, and afterwards we all thought, "Oh my God," and but that was not used.
Over on this side. Hello.
Thank you. Hello, thank you. So my question is, along with the Russia story and all the things surrounding that, there are these other stories that sort of appear and disappear. And I think it was just a couple of days ago that there was something about how Trump's cell phone wasn't secure. And I just wondered why there wasn't more information about that, because obviously Hillary's email was in every progressive, conservative publication for weeks, but this just seemed to come and go. Is there going to be more about that?
Oh, sure, we could. I mean, this is an example of there's so much flooding the zone every day. It's hard to know. I mean, there's since that's happened, there's been, a number of stories that are just way more significant in terms of the Mueller investigation. So you're right, that's a story that we should pursue more. But we had 3 or 4 major stories about Trump since then that seem to be like more cataclysmic. So that's the honest answer.
Thank you.
We've got a question here from Facebook for the Times journalists. What's the most surprising thing you learned about your colleagues during the filming or watching the movie?
Did we learn anything?
Well, I think I knew all that stuff already.
Mike's golf swing?
I don't know if it's in the, everyone just always asks me about Maggie, no matter where I am, you know? Everyone always asks me about Maggie. And the night after we won the Pulitzer, the next morning, we had gone out to dinner with our families and such, and the first email I got from my mother was, can you send the pictures of Maggie and I from last night? So, everyone loves Maggie.
I learned it. No, I'll say I learned about Maggie in texting.
Well,
Oh,
in certain places.
Well, those in New York learned about Mike's car. That you
Right,
drove a
that's
station
true.
wagon. There was a lot of chatter
Yes,
about
I forgot
that.
about the Volvo.
Yeah,
Right.
I drive my mother's Volvo station wagon.
A lot of his colleagues commented on that.
I didn't know that before, that's true.
Just a couple of brief questions. When Trump asked Russia to locate Hillary's 30,000 deleted emails, to me that's collusion, open and shut case, and also a violation of the Logan Act. Therefore, lock him up. That's one. Two, Trump says everyone calls Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, and he says everyone refers to the Russian scandalous Spygate. Those are two delusional statements. Should a person who's delusional be president of the United States, and shouldn't he be locked up and thrown into a mental ward?
Thanks for coming tonight.
Over on this side.
No, excuse me, you didn't answer my question.
Well, because it's not we're not prosecutors, and it's not because
millions of people heard him collude with Russia,
Okay.
and millions of people heard him violate the law.
I think that the response is that they are journalists and they're reporting the news and they're not responsible for bringing a case against the president.
No, but it's open and shut. A person who's a private citizen cannot engage a foreign country. That's a violation. And he asked Russia to get Hillary's emails. That's collusion.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
And he's delusional and should not be
Thank
president.
you. Thanks. We're going to move on.
I don't know why
Can we go over to this side?
Hi. So I've grown up with New York Times, the Gray Lady, always very concerned about having the most responsible language, the most careful reporting, and I think you've continued that tradition. But I do wonder, in the frustration of dealing with a president who has such a problematic relationship with the truth, do you feel that your language or your approach has changed since the election, whether in response to feeling that there was maybe a misunderstanding of Trump during the campaign, or a frustration with the ways in which Trump is held accountable to the truth? You mentioned talking about using the word lie and lying. Has Trump affected the way the Times speaks?
Maggie can talk about Trump during the campaign in our coverage, but we have used the word lie twice. It was a decision made by Dean. The first one was when he finally said, well, okay, Obama was actually born in this country, and we used lie in the headline. We also used lie a second time after he repeated over and over again that 3 million people had voted illegally in the United States in the 2016 election. And Dean's standard was that these were sustained over such a long period of time, and there was such evidence to the contrary that it had to be a lie. On the other hand, lying, saying the president lied, implies intent. And we don't know what is in his head, right? But we did it in those cases. We also have used profanity now in some of the in the Times. If it's in the words of the president, we did that right before Christmas. And so yes, it has changed the way we cover things. But Maggie can talk about the campaign.
Sure. I mean, look, it's a great question, and I think that we are constantly, as you can see from what we've said tonight, struggling, right? And I don't mean it's a struggle, but we are figuring out how to cover him because this is something different. It was clear to us during the campaign that this was something different. I think that there has been some revisionist history about how we covered Trump in the campaign. So as the person who covered him the most consistently, let me tell you some of my greatest hits during the campaign. In November 2015, I pushed for and got a front page story about him refusing to rule out a Muslim registry in the country. because I couldn't quite believe that this was something that a candidate leading the polls was leaving open. That was the first time that he started attacking me by name during the campaign. He's attacked me before that. When he finally acknowledged that President Obama was born in the United States, we called it the birther lie, and we called it the birther lie quite prominently. Alexander Burns and I did a long, it ran as a list, but it was a huge spread of his whoppers, tall tales, falsehoods. And that was just an accounting over a week. Pat Healy and I did a story a week in Trump's words. It was 95,000 words, and we looked at the demagoguery that he was engaging in. That was also November or early December of 2015. So I think we have really tried to capture how different he is. But I think one of the things that Elisabeth has pointed to, and this is just consistent, he's not a different person. He's exactly who he was in the campaign. And one of the things he did during the campaign was he would throw up a million different things so that no one thing could be easily chased. I don't think it's really a strategy anymore, that some of this is just being president. But because they have no clear message they want to chase, and they have the Russia investigation that they're dealing with, and the Cohen investigation, and North Korea, and on, there are constantly plates spinning. And we are figuring out which one deserves more importance. But I do think we are holding him accountable.
Thank you.
First of all, great footwear on the panel. My question is about social media. What is the expectation for the reporters that you post, and how much attention do you pay? Do you look at what people respond, and does it influence you at all?
It's a really good question.
Yes, Maggie.
I feel like it's being directed at me.
It kind of is.
I am way too fast on Twitter, and I need to be better about it. I turned off my mentions because, candidly, there are only so many times I need to be called a whore to get the point. I don't think that people on Twitter are usually engaging in a meaningful conversation, and usually when it's somebody who is trying to, we move over to direct message, because then you can have a nuanced back and forth. I mean, nuance is just gone in general right now, but particularly on Twitter, it's a bad format for it. Twitter is a difficult thing, right? Like there have been guidelines that have been issued. My contribution to that guideline was to remind people that you have to ask yourself if something needs to be said, and does it need to be said by you, and does it need to be said by you right now? And I follow that maybe 50% of the time. And I need to be better about it. I think that we are all still grappling with, and I have an unusually large Twitter presence, but really that was just the result of being the live tweeter during Trump's meeting at our newsroom in November of 2016. My Twitter followers went up huge because we weren't broadcasting it. And I don't remember if we had audio. I haven't really adjusted to the fact that Twitter is a thing that people treat as mini news stories, and that's really on me to get better about. So I hope that answers your question. It's as honest as I can be.
We do explore this actually in the film, in the subsequent episodes, with some time.
I get a lot of calls from New York about various tweets of reporters in the Washington Bureau, and it happens every few weeks. And then you have to go talk to the reporter, and the reporter promises to be better, and then 2 weeks later.
I'm not who she's talking to.
No, it's true. I'm not talking about, no, that's other people.
A question from Facebook, and maybe Jenny, this one is for you. Which were the most memorable or electric nights that you observed inside the newsroom?
There were so many. The one is in the film in the first episode where Elisabeth says her thing to New York. That was a first for us to see that dynamic between New York and Washington. The night that Comey was fired, which was actually, it was like 5:03 p.m., but that was a pretty electric night. Help me out, Liz. Those are the two big ones. I mean, there were also, I went to Alabama with Jeremy Peters to go to a Roy Moore rally. That was an incredible experience. We traveled with Bannon. We rode the car with Bannon and Jeremy, and that was a first for me to see the dynamic between Bannon, the press, a member of the press that he had invited himself, and how it was all spun, and that's in episode 4. That to me was really quite an eye-opening experience, just to see how it worked, and you really do get to see it in the series.
Great, we've got time for a couple more.
A quick personal question for the panel. So I think one of the great parts of the film was how we got to understand the personal sacrifices that you make, and your life, was sort of on display. Is there anything that you wish you had done differently when it comes to balancing personal life and work demands?
I mean, I'm at the other end of it. My kids are grown and they're doing well. But anything I would have done differently? I would have worried less, I think, about it. It turned out okay so far, but I would have worried less about it. Maggie's going through this. Your kids are much younger. I mean, I think it's good for, I don't think I could have done this job with smaller children. There's just no way. I've gotten more responsibility as in journalism as my kids got older. It's sort of, I think it just sort of happened. But I think that, I think women don't, I think it was good for my kids that I worked, actually. I know you're not supposed to say that, but I actually think it was good for them. It was certainly good for my daughter to see, a woman working, and it made her life different, I think. So that's my sort of answer. But Maggie's much more in the front lines with children.
No. I mean, I feel the same way. I mean, there isn't a planet in which I wouldn't be working. My mother was a single mother who worked. So I work is a critical part of who I am, and I want my children, but particularly my daughter, to see that. And I want my boys to respect a woman who works and recognize that women don't have to work less than they do. But in the context of the last 3 years, I mean, I wish that I could stay off my phone more. This is on me. This is really not just the constant, I have to be much better about sort of setting parameters. But it's hard because it's constantly going. My biggest regret, and I think I say it in episode 1, although admittedly I have not watched this since the first go around, so I don't remember if it's there. I think it is, that my kids had a really hard time during the campaign. It became very all-consuming because Trump was constantly talking. And for a while, I was literally the only Trump reporter. And I told my kids on election day that they were going to have me back after tonight. This is going to be done. Should be over by 11. And at 4 in the morning, the following morning, I got a text from my incredibly precocious 12-year-old. I don't normally talk about this, but who yes, has a cell phone because he's in junior high. And he said, "How did this happen?" And I don't, there's really no way for kids to understand a lot of what's happening right now, but certainly to have a parent not present and a parent tell them that something is going to be very different than it turns out to be, that's my big regret. So I'm very careful about what I say to them now about what to expect. So it was a learning experience for me too.
Okay, we got time for one last one.
Okay, this is more about like the newsroom dynamics. There's that one scene, Elisabeth, where you were about to submit a story and the New York office completely changed the lead. And I think it was safe to say you were frustrated with that decision. Can you talk to me a little bit about like the dynamics behind that? New York gets the ultimate say and what was going through your head?
Well, this is something that's gone on for generations. I would say probably 100 years at the New York Times. Literally, I think over 100 years. The problem with that was that it was 11:30 at night when they decided the story had been up for hours online. Millions of people had read it, and or hundreds of thousands. And so New York was changing the lead at 11:30, which meant that it was going to just be changed for print. And so that's a whole other argument, which I won't drag into. No, it's a dynamic that has existed from time. Forever between Washington and New York. It goes on between other Washington bureaus of other major publications and the New York office. it's really not as bad as it used to be. I have to tell you, it's a lot better. Dean Baquet, the executive editor, was the Washington bureau chief, and he had his own issues with New York at the time. So it's much milder now than it used to be. But of course, that's frustrating, you know. And this is sort of boring to explain to you. The problem with the lead was that, there were 3 different stories that night that led with immigration. And the other 2 had gone to bed. You know, it was too late to change them in print. And so ours was the big lead also. Matt Purdy called and said, we can't have 3 leads about immigration. And so we changed, they wanted to change to some sort of, you know, sort of general lead about the speech, which wasn't very interesting. So that's what happened. Then when you change it so late, you can't smooth out the rest of the story. And so the story I got in print the next morning was a mess. You know, it was like had this lead and the rest of it didn't make sense. I just could barely look at the paper. It just was like, ugh, you know, and that was what happened. Long explanation.
So that's it. Thank you guys so much for coming.